Okay, hello everyone. We are back with another episode. Last time we had our first episode talking about AP Language and Composition, the course itself, the skills needed to succeed, and now we're actually going to dive into what rhetoric is. So I'm going to present our slides. I'm dressed up. I just recorded my digital introduction for the school year to be put on the school website, but maybe I will continue dressing nice for these videos. We'll see. Okay, so episode 2, we will be talking today about what is rhetoric. So building off of what we talked about in the last video, College Board says that the purpose of this course is that the reading and writing students do should deepen and expand their understanding of how written language functions rhetorically, and I bolded that, to communicate writers' intentions and elicit readers' responses in particular situations. So to put it in as plain a terms as possible, these are in my own words, I define rhetoric as language choices that are made by the speaker to have an intended effect on his or her audience. Language choices, not visual choices, not specific words that are being made that are being fluctuated and emphasized and carefully picked out to have that correct effect depending on who the audience is. Okay. If you were familiar with the word rhetoric and if you had just heard it in passing, and honestly, I'm sure when I was in high school, this course wasn't offered when I was in high school, and my exposure with the word rhetoric was in a negative connotation. And if you look up the word rhetoric, you'll find that the definition can be described as hollow, artificial language, often used by politicians. And that's a lot of times in modern discussion, you'll hear that usage of the word rhetoric. Somebody saying, well, that's just empty rhetoric said by that politician. And that is a use of it, but we're approaching rhetoric under the impression that, well, with the understanding that rhetoric is ubiquitous, it's all around us, it's present in our everyday lives, and it's not limited to just silver-tongued politicians, as I put it. Any use of language that seeks a desired effect from the audience is by nature, by definition, rhetorical. Okay, so the difference between rhetorical language and something like literary language would be if you write a poem, you're trying to express a certain emotion, capture a feeling, but you're not as preoccupied with how it affects the audience. I guess you could argue that you do have to take that into account in some parts, and I've had debates with AP Lit teachers about this point, but with rhetoric, you are always thinking about who your audience is and how what you say or write to them will affect how they process what you're saying. So here are some examples of when you would be using rhetoric or have it used on you, so to speak. So if you're with your friends and you're debating about where to go to a restaurant and you're trying to convince your group of friends, let's go to Denny's. And so you might say, let's go to Denny's. I have been there. I've been to all the restaurants in this town, and Denny's is always the best. I've never had a bad meal at Denny's, right? Like you're trying to convince them to go to Denny's, right? Or you're with a significant other and you're trying to convince them not to break up with you. And you might say, you can't break up with me. You might be very emotional about it. Probably you are. If you're dealing with a breakup, you might say, I can't function without you. You are essential to my existence. You might use very hyperbolic, over the top language, right? But your desired effect is to stay in that relationship. You're trying to affect that person you're talking to not break up with you. Or a teacher, you're trying to get them to give you an extension. You might say, if it's the middle of the year, you might say, dear Mr. Smith, I've always turned in things on time. I've had a rough couple of days, didn't get enough sleep. I feel I have demonstrated consistent good manners in your class. I think you would agree that I've been a an amazing student thus far, and I would really appreciate it if you would be kind enough to offer me an extension. You might use, that language is totally different from the type that you'd use with your significant other trying to get them to stop breaking up with you, or with your friends trying to encourage them to go to Denny's. With the teacher, you might use much more formal, much more obsequious, or very subservient language, right? If you know that teacher is moved by that sort of language. Maybe if you're friends with the teacher, if the teacher's cool, right? Or if the teacher wants you to treat them more casually, you might be like, yo, teach, I'd love an extension, please. Thank you, bud, right? Like, but you'd make that choice based on how your relationship with the teacher is, and you would adjust your language accordingly if you want to get your desired purpose, which would be the extension. If you don't care, well, then you're not really going to calibrate your language at all. You're probably not even going to bother to send that email, would you? So do I have to keep going on? I mean, if you use rhetoric, if you're trying to convince your parents to buy you a new phone, you might, and again, you might use a mix of emotion, saying, I will never talk to you again, and I will hate you for the rest of my life if you don't buy me a new phone, mom and dad. You might use negative emotion. You might use a positive emotion. I will love you for the rest of my life if you get me this new iPhone. You might use logic. You might say, we will actually save a lot of money if you let me upgrade, and there's actually a new deal going on. Or you might use some sort of authority on the matter. You might say, I've actually been reading a lot of Consumer Report, and the new iPhone actually conserves battery life, which means we will save money on the electric bill. And so you're using a mix of logic and your own authority on the matter of the iPhones to try to convince your parents. So in all four of the first ones, you're the one doing the talking and using rhetoric, but it also gets used on you, obviously. And an area that's so popular in AP Lang is commercials, looking at the rhetoric of commercials. And you see those obviously online every day, on Instagram, on any social media that you use is filled with all sorts of ads. And if you look at them, they're often very carefully calibrated to try to achieve the desired effect, which is what do commercials want you to do? I will have wait time for you to think about that. But you don't really need that wait time, because commercials want you to buy something. You know that. You're in 11th or 12th grade. You know that that's what commercials want you to do. They want you to buy stuff. But it can also even be in less baldly commercial or materialistic areas, such as PetSmart. And this is an example I gave to my students a couple years ago, and I feel like it was very impactful for them. So I'm going to show it to you. I go to PetSmart often with my son just to look at the animals and get out of the house. And we don't have pets. I have a fish in the house currently. But anyway, we look at the cats, and he says hi to them, and it's very cute. And PetSmart, you can adopt these cats, and they provide these little descriptions, neat things to know about me. And notice, and we could sit there and pick apart the language that's used here. Let me read this first one. My name is Rose. I can be shy initially, but once I get to know you, I am really a great girl. I love other kitties. I was outside for a while, but would rather be an indoor kitty. So what's going on? Like, the intended purpose, the person who wrote this wanted what? They want you to read it and do what? They want you to adopt the cat. So why didn't they just write, please adopt this cat? The person writing it was, in my opinion, they were clever. They knew their audience. A lot of people who are reading these descriptions, they might not be affected by somebody just writing simply, please adopt this cat. We need to find a new home for it. They write it, first of all, when I asked my students to start picking apart the language, they very quickly picked up on the fact this is written from the point of view of the cat. It's creating this artifice that the cat wrote it herself, Rose wrote it, which it appeals to you. You're like, oh, wow, this cat needs a home. She's a good kitty, according to her. It's written in very simple language. It's very easy to understand. A young kid with a rudimentary understanding of the English language would be able to understand it, which again, very shrewd. The kids are very persuasive to their parents. So if you can get the kids to read it and understand it, oh, mom, well, we should adopt Rose. She's been outside for a while, but she would rather be an indoor kitty. We would love an indoor kitty, right, mom? Very careful choice of language to achieve the purpose of getting you to adopt the cat. So there's Clover. Is that Clover? Yeah, the gray tabby. We note in there, this one, poor kitty, has FIV, feline HIV, leukemia negative, though. I always note when we're looking at this one, please help me find a home. A desperate, imperative sentence at the end. Help me. Desperate. They don't end with the kind of concerning information about the feline AIDS. They tuck it in the middle so that you might likely, hopefully, not have that be the last thing that you remember. It's the last thing you remember is that Clover needs a new home. So we keep going on with these. I will, for the sake of time, move on with rhetoric. But hopefully right now you're getting the idea that rhetoric is trying to convince. It's carefully chosen language that is about achieving a purpose. And I say to convince, and the vast majority of the time it is trying to make the audience change their mindset in some way. I have a brief, and I will post these notes in the description for this video. I have a link to Aristotle's treatise on rhetoric, which was, it's the foundational text of rhetoric as a thing, as a linguistic principle, but not essential to know really anything about the history of rhetoric. I skimmed through it last year because I felt it was the responsible thing to have read it, and I just couldn't find anything that I felt like was going to help my students do well in the class. I'm not trying to dissuade you from reading it if you have time, but don't feel like you need to read it or reference Aristotle at all in the course of writing essays on the exam. Another thing, rhetoric is not fighting, and this has become a very important distinction to make, and it's a mindset that you need to get out of your head as you participate in this class, because notwithstanding the way people argue with one another online and frankly in politics today, true rhetoric that gets brought in this class is subtle. It's not trying to verbally bully you into place. It is trying to accomplish the objective and convince you, to put you on the audience's side, not be scared or just shut up and put in your place, if that makes sense. So keep that in mind. Rhetoric is not fighting. When you're analyzing it, keep that in mind. And when you're writing it, keep that in mind. College Board wants you to achieve any sort of sophistication in your writing. College Board expects you to have the ability to see many different perspectives of different issues that they put before you. And the ability to understand other perspectives will hopefully help you construct a very convincing argument, because the more well-rounded in your ability to see issues you are, the more convincing you will be. That's College Board's thinking. And I, for the most part, agree with that. So how do you convince someone? I've already kind of hinted at these words before: emotion, logic, and your own authority. And it's very likely this has already been brought up in a prior English class. Hopefully at some point you've had a teacher talk about logos, ethos, and pathos. That's going to be the last time I'm going to really reference the Greek words logos, ethos, and pathos, because a lot of times you use those words and students will cling to those three words like a life raft when they're writing an essay, and just sort of hoping that by saying the writer uses logos, the writer uses ethos, they will have written a careful analysis. And it's not enough to do that. And it makes you look like the kid in the last video who was stuffed in a suit that didn't fit him. Just because you throw out some fancy words doesn't mean you understand what you're talking about. It's better to just simply understand A good argument, convincing argument, generally has a balance of emotion, logic, and often your own authority on the subject matter. But always a mix of emotion and logic. It's very rare you'd see a convincing argument that is solely based on emotion or just solely based on logic. There's always a blend if you look carefully at it. So with that said, just try to think of it in plain spoken terms, emotion, logic, and your own authority, and try to just not feel the need to bring up logos, ethos, pathos. Okay, so we've gone over some of the fun examples, the real life examples, commercials, PetSmart, your parents, your friends. And while there is rhetoric everywhere you look, effective rhetorical writing, the type that you see on the exam, is carefully composed. And some would say it's boring, or it's dry, or it's not easily understood. And I guess College Board would probably agree with you. They would say it's not boring, and I would agree with them on that. Effective rhetoric is not boring, but it's not simple to look at and understand and immediately be able to pick apart. It requires careful thought, college level thought. So keep that in mind. You should be, through the course of this class, engaging with challenging texts that ask you to pick apart those principles. So as I note here, analyzing this balance is the heart of Lang. The exam will always contain complex pieces for the RA essay and the multiple choice passages. They will be much more intellectual than an argument with your parents, right, or a PetSmart adoption plea. The more you can emulate this nuanced style in your persuasive essays, the higher you will score. So this is one thing I feel like I haven't emphasized enough in my teaching, but it should be the experience of reading and annotating rhetoric should not be in a vacuum from the process of your writing. As you read and appreciate fine rhetoric, you should be trying to implement those skills in your own writing. And as you work on your own writing, you should be looking for what you do well in other writers, if that makes sense. And I'll talk about that when I talk about the structure of a well-written essay. Okay, another thing that you shouldn't necessarily worry about too much is the rhetorical triangle. I see it a lot, and it looks like something out of a math class or the occult, or it kind of looks like the thing on the dollar bill with the I in it. I don't know. We have an acronym we'll talk about in a future. I'm setting aside a whole video to talk about the acronym SpaceCat, which accomplishes everything in the triangle. This triangle is supposed to represent the very elaborate interaction of all these different things that take part in rhetoric. But you're a busy person, you're taking a lot of classes, and I feel like it's much easier to comprehend an acronym and the utility of that acronym than a weird looking triangle. It's not practical, in my opinion. Hey, and maybe it's because I just am not an effective teacher with this triangle. Maybe somebody will message me and explain to me what value this thing has. But for right now, I'm saying don't worry about it. Also, rhetorical fallacies such as straw man, begging the question, slippery slope, etc. There are so many fallacies. I mean, and they kind of, and there's no like person who invents names for fallacies, but it feels like, I don't know, there's no definitive list of them, but there's some main ones like begging the question, slippery slope, and straw man. And I'm saying don't worry about them. You should, for one, in my opinion, it's not responsible to look at flawed rhetoric, because you're not even going to have enough time to read enough good rhetoric. So you shouldn't, in my opinion, waste time reading rhetoric that fails or that is severely flawed. If I see something different about the new test that convinces me that there's a reason to learn about rhetorical fallacies, I will revise that strategy, but it does not appear in multiple choice. If it does, it's maybe one question out of every 10 years worth of multiple choice packets I've looked through. It's just not necessary for success in the class, understanding rhetorical fallacies. And frankly, discussing rhetorical fallacies can start a lot of subjective debates about what is logical. There's some fallacies that are based upon the premise that a belief in a God is a logical flaw. And if as a teacher I was to present that to my students, I would definitely open up a huge can of worms. So again, like the triangle, I think it's unnecessary, and you can have lots of success in the class just making it very clear cut. Devote the majority of your time analyzing and imitating effective written rhetoric. And I'm bolding those, and I will keep hammering that home. Analyzing effective written rhetoric and imitating effective written rhetoric. And that's going to be the focus of this whole series. Written rhetoric, not visual, not auditory. Well, I guess auditory if it's a speech, but even if it's a speech, you'll have a transcript that you can read. So it's still written. Okay, so next episode, we're going to look at the different modes of effective written rhetoric. I think that is an important thing to know. We'll discuss different genres, such as press conferences, letters, open letters, editorials, op-eds, and I will try to explain what makes them unique and different, and that will hopefully be a resource for you as you move forward in the course. So as always, thank you for watching. I will include contact information in the description, as well as a link to these notes. And yes, until next time, have a good evening.